Please be seated. There have been news stories over the past few days of this week about the Quid Foundation. Perhaps you've heard some of those stories. In the news, not for necessarily the best reasons. Not because, as the foundation likes to point out, they have been in over 70 countries around the world, helping millions of adults and children gain access to HIV and AIDS medicines at somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% less than the cost previous to the Clinton Foundation's work. Not in the news because they have been in the Latin American countries and they've helped over 500,000 living there with job coaching and entrepreneurial endeavors. Not in the news because actually they're in every state here in our country in over 31,000 different schools attempting to offer programs for children around health and physical education. They're not in the news for any of those reasons. They're in the news because they've been accused of sort of playing a pay-to-play sort of game with their donors. The AP reported that Secretary of State Clinton, although she said that she would announce and make clear the names of all the countries and individuals who had donated to the foundation in the years from 2009 to 2012, apparently she didn't do so. They also, in this article, reported that during the time that she was Secretary of State, outside of the time that she was doing governmental meetings, 50% of her meetings were with individuals who had contributed to the Clinton Foundation, suggesting that access comes with pay. Not surprisingly, her presidential opponent has suggested that there should be an independent investigation about her activity. Now, I gotta tell you, just to be clear, I'm not exactly sure what to make of all of this kerfuffle. I get that it sounds problematic and a little shady. I also applaud the humanitarian efforts of the Clinton Foundation. I found myself, as I've been listening to the news anchors and to the various surrogates for each campaign, I found myself sort of nodding my head, not necessarily in agreement, but at least in understanding about what they're saying. It's kind of all over the map. But I did hear one commentator saying one thing that was so clear and so undeniable that no one could refute. And it was this. She said, look, why should we be surprised? We live in a quid pro quo world. We live in a quid pro quo world. We get a gospel passage from Luke today, and it's actually, Luke sort of squeezed two lessons in the frame of one event. Jesus being invited to the Pharisees' home for a Sabbath supper. Here's a little bit of trivia. Next time you're invited to a dinner party, you can share this with your friends there. I'm sure it will amaze them. Luke wrote more about meals from suppers to banquets and feasts than any other gospel writer in the Bible. Just stick that away and bring it out to a party or something. I love it that he loves to talk about eating and meals. Maybe that's why Luke's one of my favorites. More seriously, you should know that it was the table that Luke places most often as Jesus' classroom of sorts. And you should also know that the people gathered around that table, the people that Jesus liked to have around that table, represented the people that Jesus expected to be hanging out with when it was time for the kingdom of heaven. So look, there are two stories, like I said. The first one, we get a little sort of biblical mismanners about, don't take the seat of honor. And it's a lesson that sort of pricks our sense of self-importance, our hubris and pride. None of us have to worry about that. So I'm not going to talk about that one, okay? That was a joke. You can laugh at that. I'm not going to talk about that. I want to focus on the second parable that Jesus tells. And this parable sort of goes at both the host, who has invited this collection of diners, and the diners themselves, right? He says, look, when you have a lunch or a dinner, don't just invite your brother or your family or your rich neighbors, expecting that sometime soon they will repay you in kind. But instead, invite who? Invite the poor, the blind, the lame, the hungry. Those are the people that the Pharisees to invite. Well, can you imagine the Pharisees' response? The nerve of this Jesus character telling him who he should invite to a party. He's probably thinking, wait a second. Now, the poor, the lame, the blind, those people, they're barely allowed inside our cities or synagogues, much less should they have a place at my dinner table. And he's probably thinking, righteously, the reason that they're suffering from these conditions is because they're being punished for their sins. Because that was the understanding that some of these early Jews had about how God operated with God's creation. So there's no way I'm having those kinds of people at my party. Not to mention, what good would it do me? They're not people of influence. They're not people of power. And they certainly aren't going to have any great banquet that I care to attend to. So why would I invite them? And of course, that's just the point that Jesus is trying to make. He's trying to say to them, so look, change the way you relate to one another. Stop relating to one another based upon, so what am I going to get out of this? What's in it for me? What can you do if I do something nice for you? Stop relating to one another with a calculus that sort of measures the reward that you might gain if you do something kind. Or in short, stop relating to one another in a quid pro quo kind of way. So quid pro quo is Latin, I believe. It means something like this for that, right? If there's a Latin scholar in here, you can refine that for me later. Or it means, it's come to mean in our world, well, something for something. Sort of an exchange, quid pro quo. Jesus is saying, God's world, God's kingdom, it's not going to be a quid pro quo kind of operation. That old Hebrew understanding of an eye for an eye, that's no longer. And this has been something that Jesus has been trying to teach since the moment he started his public ministry. He's the one that said, look, if someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. If someone hates you, if someone curses you, pray for your enemies. He's been trying to say that we need to treat people differently than however they might treat us. That's his point from the start, and that's his point here at the dinner tonight. No more quid pro quo activity. Think about how that permeates all of our relationships in this world. That quid pro quo kind of understanding. I'm not just talking about the sort of large-scale quid pro quo where we try to curry favors or we try to suck up to someone in power. I'm talking about the more subtle and yet insidious quid pro quo that infects our relationships. So that when someone is rude to us, we're rude to them in return. If someone cuts us off in the streets, we honk our horn and maybe use a little sign language. Because they started it. If someone rejects us, we reject them. I mean, that's how it happens. It happens in schools. It happens at work. It happens in our neighborhoods. It happens in our marriages and in our families. Jesus is always about trying something new and different. Try a new way to exercise power. Try a new way to form community. And try a new way to relate to one another. A way that's not based upon a quid pro quo exchange. Jesus challenges us to be generous, even when someone is selfish. Jesus challenges us to be compassionate, even when someone seems uncaring. Jesus challenges us to be kind, even when someone is unkind. Jesus challenges us to be forgiven, even when someone seems to be cold-hearted. Jesus challenges us to be people of peace, even when someone seems to be violent. Jesus challenges us to be people of grace, even if someone seems undeserving. Imagine how our world might be different if we're no longer based upon the quid pro quo system. That's how Jesus lived his life. And that's how Jesus gave his life too. You know, if we could just understand this just a little bit more, this new way of relating that wasn't based on the old quid pro quo currency, if we could understand and relate to each other just a little bit more that way, then I think maybe, just maybe, we also might be able to understand that we have a gracious and loving God who's just dying to be in a relationship with us in that new way too.